All right. Let's see if this works here. Okay, good. Good afternoon. Welcome to the DDoS panel. My name is Michael Bailey, and I'll be the moderator for the panel. We don't have slides for you today. We don't have prepared remarks for you today. We hope that this becomes an interactive set of content between you, the audience, and the panel members. We certainly have some questions prepared to get the ball rolling, but the faster you can get up to the mic, I think the more interesting it's going to be for both us as well as you to guide the conversations. The inception of this panel was originally, and I guess still is, to honor the Test of Time Award paper. Those of you that didn't note that the paper from 2001, Inferring Internet Denial of Service Attack Activity, won the Test of Time Award. And so as we were thinking about what invited talks we might have or panels that we created, we're sort of inspired by the panel last year, those of you that attended with Niels and Peter and some of the folks. We thought that was such a great idea and it was so well received that we try to do that again. Now, unfortunately, Stefan Savage, who was going to represent the authors in that paper, was not available at the last minute due to a family emergency. And so we will still at least begin with the spirit of talking about that paper and its impact, but hopefully quickly move into some of the thoughts that we have on denial of service and start a conversation with you, the audience, as well. I'm going to start by letting the panel introduce themselves and ask a bit of a question, ask them what their first experience or exposure to denial of service was, what the first time they remember hearing that word that stuck at least in their memories, and I'll certainly then answer that question myself. But let's go ahead and start with Tom.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Anderson. I teach computer science at the University of Washington. This is the first time I've been to this conference. Oh, sorry, this is echoing a little bit. But my first experience, actually, my background was operating systems when I did my dissertation, and then more distributed systems during the period before I started doing networking research. I happened to be as I transitioned to go back to University of Washington as a faculty member, there was a colleague of mine, David Witherell, who had been truly experienced doing networking research, and so knew where all the problems were. Denial of service had been an issue that the internet community knew about for a long time, and he was particularly interested in how to make networking more plastic, more agile. Essentially, his thesis work was on active networks. You think of it as the predecessor for software-defined networks today. Anyway, so one of the questions was, what could we do with a little bit of computation and routers to make denial of service easier to deal with? And the idea that we came up with was essentially to try to deal with people who were spoofing their source address in their denial of service attacks, and that we would do a little bit of labeling on packets to be able to figure out where people came from. And of course, you could think, oh, okay, there won't be enough room in the packet header to be able to label every packet. So the idea was basically to do a little bit of labeling that if you had a whole long stream of packets, you could then add them up to be able to identify the source. Anyway, that's where we started with it.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Sullivan. I'm, I guess, an engineer, researcher, operator. I work at a company called Cloudflare, which is a service that sits between web services and the outside world, the internet and traffic. I guess I've, over the last 4 years or so, seen some of the biggest and worst DDoS attacks from all different layers of the stack against Cloudflare's infrastructure. And I guess the earliest time that I've dealt with DDoS, I guess the more impactful time was, I guess, the first time that Cloudflare was in the news for being able to withstand what was recorded in the news at the time as the largest DDoS in history, which was against Spamhaus. And seeing that attack and speaking with the people at Cloudflare actually inspired me to to join up and help deal with these sort of massive scale problems on the internet.
All right, I'm Damon McCoy. I'm a professor at New York University. Probably my first experience with DDoS was hearing old war stories from way back in the day. So we had a professor, Evie Nemeth, that had dealt with a lot of the original DDoS attacks, the original one caused by the Morris worm, I believe. That at the time I was at the University of Colorado, and I think it basically took the entire campus off and the mail server. So she had these stories about how they had to let the mail server back connected to the main internet. It would get infected with the worm, download the email, then they would have to disconnect it, clean it, and then reconnect it to the internal campus network so that people could get their email. So this was kind of a poor defense against DDoS attacks and stuff like that. And so this kind of made me aware of how vulnerable the internet was to it. But I actually didn't start doing much research in the area of DDoS attacks and defenses until I started getting interested into actually the operation in terms of the business sense of these DDoS attacks.
And again, my name is Michael Bailey. I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois, where I do networking security. The first time I had heard about DDoS is when my advisor at the time at the University of Michigan had talked about this really interesting research project that was going on in the lab. I was a first-year, second-year graduate student. He said, you know, the senior guy, this guy called Rob Mallon, is working on this really cool project on denial of service attacks. Would you be interested in sort of joining him on that paper and doing some of that work? And I said, no, this is a really dumb idea. I'm going to go spend time playing computer games. And so about 2 years later, after they'd done a bunch of work on that grant, gotten some papers on the idea, Rob and Farnham came back, my advisor came back again and said, hey, look, we're going to leave the university for a while and start a company working on denial of service attack stuff. Do you want to come? And I said, no, I'm going to go work on dynamic web caching instead and stay at the university. 2 years later after that, I finally learned my lesson, and I joined them at this company called Arbor Networks, where I was director of engineering for a group of about 40 different individuals building their denial of service tools. The last time Arbor measured things, they estimated between 70 and 75% of all end-to-end packets on the internet go through an Arbor box sometime along their path. So they have some pretty big visibility in helping alongside of folks like Cloudflare and others to protect us and keep our infrastructure up. So that was the first time, and of course the first 2 times I had heard it, I thought it was a nonsense idea and wanted to do something else. I quickly learned the failure of that mistake. Speaking of other learning opportunities, I learned a long time ago from my advisor, who obviously from that story clearly much smarter than I am, that you don't complain about things, at least to the wrong set of people. So you complain about how slow some university system is for entering grades. The next semester you find yourself on the dean's committee for faculty advisory on infrastructure. You complain about how slow the Wi-Fi was yesterday. You're going to be on the tech committee for USENIX. So I learned that lesson pretty early. I don't complain a lot about other stuff. What I hadn't learned, and did eventually learn, is that you can get in trouble for saying nice things about stuff as well. When Casey told the Invited Talks committee that Stefan was going to win this paper for that, win the Test of Time award for this Inferring Internet Denial of Service Attack paper, I said, that's great. This is one of the best papers that I read. It probably is the paper that first got me moving from all these crazy other things that I was doing, like games and dynamic web caching and other stuff, into really thinking about security. And in fact, one might argue that if this paper didn't exist, my thesis wouldn't exist. And she said, ha, 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 ha. So I'm going to moderate the panel today. And again, I know we're going to move sort of very quickly away from this because, of course, some of the authors that were here, Jeff and Stefan, couldn't make it. But I know, Tom, that you did have a chance to speak a little bit. So certainly you were involved a lot thinking with Stefan at that time and the kinds of things he was thinking about. And I know you had a chance to talk to Jeff about a little bit about this, but I was wondering a little bit about the history of that paper. Do you know sort of how they came up with that idea and what they thought they were doing when they did it?
Yeah, so in part prep for this was to try to train me to be Erzat Stefan, which of course is impossible. I should say for those of you who are students in the audience, almost everybody, it's one of those things that you can look at for people who are faculty, is that for most of us, we didn't actually start out this way. That is, you can think, oh, there's no way I'm going to ever be somebody like that. We actually, most of us, just started out like really not knowing anything about anything at all. But Stefan was always like out there in terms of, even for the first time I ever met him, he was extremely insightful about what the problems are, what the solutions were. This particular paper originated by accident. Actually, many of the other work that I've done in that area was also by accident. We just started measuring things, and then we would come up with things that were interesting outcomes. So, for example, that the internet doesn't obey triangle routing we just happened to measure it. In this case, it happened to be that the people at CADA were had built a system to basically measure the return traffic that they were getting from the internet to be able to do log analysis of things like TCP traces. And they just happened after they turned it on, saw a bunch of SYNAC packets, which essentially are TCP handshake replies, coming on their network. And it was like these addresses that were in these packets that they were tracing couldn't possibly make sense because those addresses that they were monitoring didn't actually exist. There was no machine that had sent a SYN packet. So essentially, they had tripped over the fact that there was these spoofed amplification attacks, essentially reply attacks that were happening. So somebody would send a spoof SYN packet. It would reply back to they would pick a source address, which was a random address, essentially to obfuscate where it was coming from, and then it would reply back to that random address. Because they were monitoring a fairly large portion of the internet, they would see some large fraction of those packets, and then that was what actually was the source of the paper. Anyway, you had mentioned actually earlier that you had something about what you thought the impact of the paper was over time. Not being from the community, I think it might be easier for you to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the idea of looking at scale at routed but unused address space. I mean, certainly we do this in micro with honeypots for a lot of what we do in this community, but looking for large swaths of that space certainly became the foundation of what my thesis was involved with. I thought it really interesting that it moved from this sort of accidental discovery that people were spoofing packets to then a tool that became used for early worm detection and monitoring to, I think it's even so prevalent now. There was recently a paper that basically said the absence of background radiation from a network is telling about whether or not that network is available and online. So ubiquitous is this background radiation or noise in the network that consists of scanning behaviors, but also this backscatter behavior that was in there, that it really sort of spawned a whole new way of doing indications and warnings for things like DDoS and other stuff. So very, very interesting. I couldn't have imagined thinking that that's the direction it was going to go, and maybe it was just all serendipity, which is a lot of how this works.
What Jeff said about it was that although you could post hoc give this story about how they had a 15-year vision that really they were going to do this sequence of studies that was going to Vern is laughing. A sequence of studies that was going to lead to, for example, knowing when a country turns off its internet because you stop getting background traffic from it. But in fact, actually, what he said, even the worm detection was by accident. So they had turned on this backscatter work, and they were doing a longitudinal study, and it happened to be, I think, code red. Happened to happen while they had turned this on, and so they suddenly started getting essentially pings from every newly code red infected machine because it was doing random probes to find other machines to identify. So essentially they had then tripped over, hey, this would be a mechanism to do worm propagation measurement. It was like, Okay. So if there's a lesson here, it's for students, start measuring things. You'll find out something somebody else doesn't know. And again, Vern, I think, really pioneered this, at least for me, in the networking space. So I kind of came late to it. But.
Absolutely. So, and by the way, just as a side here, Bill is modeling the proper behavior for asking a question. We are recording the talk, so while we could probably hear you if you shout, they're not going to hear it on the recording. So please do step up to the mic if you have a question.
Just for a second, just one other anecdote about this. So Jeff said, I think appropriately so, he said actually there's nothing that makes you feel older than winning a Test of Time award for something that you did 17 years ago. So I was like, okay, being the advisor of somebody. That's the time award. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
So my name is Bill Cheswick. I currently hang out at Penn sometimes. And if you think you feel old, I'm about to tell a little story from 1989. And to give you a better idea, I was working at Bell Labs, and we were a little short on address space, so we asked for a Class A network, and they gave it to us. That's where Net 12 came from. And it sat unused around the labs for a year. We were trying to figure out how to deploy it, use it inside. The Cray only wanted a Class A network and so on. But we had troubles getting the routers. Routers did not like using Class A networks. We couldn't subroute it and so on. But the point was, one day I said, gosh, maybe we should announce this and point all the Net 12 traffic to here. And I set it up, put in the announcement, set a little thing in the router that said anything to Net 12 goes to Ethernet address 1:2:3:4:5:6 and run that into a TCP dump just to see what's coming in from the internet. And what I got is internet background radiation, the death screams of machines out on the internet that were receiving spoofed addresses, and some of the attacks decided they wanted the return address to be that awful AT&T. And yes, we could tell all over the world where machines were being attacked just by putting up this packet telescope.
Awesome, great, thanks for sharing. So I think one of the things that came up in that paper is this idea of spoofing. So the surprise, perhaps, to some of us at the time that people would lie about where they were sending traffic from to IP. Of course, this seems sort of obvious now, but I think it was surprising at the time. One of the other things that's enabled by this kind of spoofing is this more recent, I would say recent in air quotes now because that space moves pretty quick, but this notion of amplification attacks that we've seen over the last couple years. And if you look at some of the marketing material, again, I'm sort of a little biased by the Arbor marketing material, but they talk about this thing called the hockey stick era. There's this nice trend line of year-over-year growth in denial of service attacks, and it goes like this over the last 3 years. And this is mostly attributable to the large amount of volumetric attacks that are based on amplification. So I don't know, maybe Nick, if you want to say something to that, or I know, Damon, you do a lot of work in booters, where this is sort of the canonical method that they use to make these attacks happen. But little thoughts on amplification attacks.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned the last 3 years, and I think 3 years ago was maybe around the peak of amplification attacks. And over time, there are different protocols where you send one packet, and then the response is X times larger. And the larger that X is, the more the traffic is. And this also lends itself to reflection as well if it's sort of a single UDP packet. So a couple years ago, NTP. This is a great protocol, I guess, maybe not that great, but it's something that helps synchronize time over the internet. And there was a specific type of message you could send that says, hey, give me all the previous people who asked for NTP time. And this was a very large packet that you could send back. And around, I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago, people realized that this was a very powerful attack vector for amplification. And there were a small number of open NTP servers that could just answer these responses and send the traffic to anywhere. So we see different spikes as different attackers realize that these different UDP protocols have different levels of amplification. The most classic one is DNS. And DNS, you send a question, and typically you get a response. It's going to be larger. With very large responses like DNS any queries, you can get large multiplicative factors. And if you get anywhere above 20x, then this becomes a very valuable target for people to point at you. So we've seen NTP come, and a very large attack. We saw, I think it was something around 400 gigabits per second around 3 years ago. And the way to shut it down, I guess, is it's very difficult to convince people around the internet to configure their servers correctly. But there's kind of a name and shame aspect that tended to work for NTP. There was like a published list of like, your address space is sending this traffic. Shame on you. Please fix it. But NTP really hasn't gotten worse since then. It's actually gotten better. So there's sort of these trends, like, as you said, a hockey stick, but it's an aggregate of different types of attacks. And so different protocols become popular. As I mentioned, NTP was about 3 years ago. DNS has been happening for a while. More recently, the SSDP protocol has been used, and we've seen pretty large attacks from this. This has to do with universal plug and play. And the more of those devices that are on the internet, the more often you can see these attacks. So when designing a protocol, you really have to think of if it's an unauthenticated request, it'll send something back. Keep the response size small, or at least less than 10x, less than 20x.
Or a handshake. I mean, I actually
Sure.
do not understand why anyone would design a protocol in the modern age, a new protocol in the modern age that didn't handshake. I mean, just this has been a problem that we've known for 20 years. That just makes no sense to me. So but it is the case, like, we've known how to deal with this problem for a long time. There was actually, if I went back and looked, that the original RFCs for there is a protocol for ISPs to essentially filter spoofed packets, which was one of the ways that you would get around dealing with this, which essentially try to clip off any of these amplification attacks at where the source was. And that one dates from 2000. So people have known about this for a long time. And yet we still have DNS.
Yeah, I think these amplification attacks are interesting, and Christian Russo a while ago did some really interesting work looking at not even just the UDP aspect, but even like accidental retransmission of things like TCP handshakes can result in these big amplification attacks as well, depending on how many times you try and retransmit something without completing an actual handshake to it. And the other thing to point out is the other kinds of tricks, like peer-to-peer networks, are places where you can basically advertise some victim's IP address and attract a large amount of attention to draw down these kinds of amplification attacks. So yeah, I think echoing what Nick said is you have to be very cognizant when you're designing these protocols to try and avoid these kinds of amplification potential for your protocols.
I think this is an interesting follow-up question to that, because I think Tom alluded to this a little bit. Remember, amplification attacks require two different things, right? They require the ability to spoof or lie about your source address. And there's been a best common practice, BCP 38, that's been around since 2000, and that rocks to me to be about right? And then you have to have these unfiltered, unauthenticated queries, i.e. you have to pull up a service that will respond with more information. The response is bigger than the query size by some factor. So, interesting sort of things about, if we've known since 2000 that we're supposed to filter people who are lying out of our, this is called egress filtering, right? Your network shouldn't forward anything that's not actually, unless you're transit, sourced from me, right? If somebody's lying about it, you should drop that on the floor before it even gets out of your network. If we've known about that for forever, and we had this sort of idea that there are millions. I mean, when people did the shaming exercises, the original lists for both DNS and NTP were at least in the high hundreds of thousands, if not millions. It boggles my mind that people would need 1 million open DNS servers. Again, remember that requirement. You have to be willing to take a request from anybody and resolve. So there are in fact millions of them, and millions of NTP servers. So if DNS is ludicrous, then the notion of not having policy blocking your NTP servers, that there are hundreds of thousands of open time servers that will take a query from anywhere, and in some cases actually not even give you the time. There's a bunch of NTP servers that respond to NTP but don't actually give you any time, or give you a completely wrong time, which is also quite interesting. So I was just wondering about your thoughts on, I mean, I think, and Nick, you alluded to it too, this, so, we're not doing what we're supposed to do. We know what we're supposed to do, but it's not happening. Some things were patched faster, like this shaming thing seemed to work a little bit. There are a bunch of people that got shamed and patched DNS and NTP, but at vastly different rates. There is very slow continued adoption based to some shaming folks. CADA is involved with that, and the folks I think Naval Postgraduate School are trying to call out people that are not following this particular pattern as well. So that seems to work. But why aren't we doing what we're supposed to do? Why are we leaving these huge holes open?
Well, I can't really speak to BCP 38, but for DNS, there's a number of different ways that you can cause amplification, and there are many different actors in the DNS space. You have recursive resolvers. It used to be that your ISP would provide this to you. You'd query the ISP, it would fetch the DNS response to you. Now you have OpenDNS and Google DNS and these sort of larger open resolvers. And these can be used now to kind of launder your requests. And the other piece of the puzzle here is authoritative DNS servers. And these will answer questions for DNS zones that they're authoritative for, no matter what the incoming IP address is, for the most part, and asking authoritative DNS servers to filter some IPs versus others leads to some sort of questionable restrictions in terms of internet net neutrality and things like that. So I think DNS is a very hard question, and maybe the best approach is to make sure that your responses are not large multiples. But when it comes to egress traffic, you're right. It hasn't been a very high uptake. I think the last time I checked, it was around 50% of networks do BCP 38 filtering properly.
Yeah, I would also point out that I think the interesting study on censorship from yesterday, I'm not certain it would have been possible to do if we had a default model that said that DNS, everyone essentially, you could only provide DNS answers to a subset of people that you already know. Wouldn't work. Yeah, it wouldn't work. So one other thing about BCP is why do ISPs not filter? Well, there are a lot of ISPs out there. One of the things you discover working in the ISP space is, you might think, oh, there's only a handful of really big companies, and that's true. That's almost all the companies there are, but there are a lot of little itty bitty ISPs. We started doing kind of an equivalent version of like measurement-oriented work. It was actually to discover misconfigurations that were happening inside of the internet, essentially BGP announcements. We found there was this ISP in Africa that repeatedly announced itself as essentially tried to hijack Unionet, which was the biggest ISP in the world at the time. And it was like you could see this BGP announcement just periodically getting out. Actually, Cisco had this example where they had like BGP is a very complicated protocol, and so they would provide help for people to program their routers, and their instructions are essentially do this to your router. People would cut and paste it, and what you would discover is that Cisco found that its own prefix was being hijacked because they had used their own prefix in the instructions, and people didn't even know enough to replace it. So a lot of it is just how complicated these protocols are that just for people who are operating really small operations are just not really set up for it. And then once you get in the peering space, it's very difficult for you to have any kind of way of filtering on source addresses. So I actually think the source address filtering is probably a non-starter. We've been trying to do it for a while, but one other thing I wanted to say about source addressing, there are actually active good things that you can do with source address spoofing. That is that there are positive things one can do with source address spoofing. In particular, one of my students had done a study. If you wanted to go understand that there was some black hole in the middle of the network, some router that had advertised a route that it wasn't actually delivering traffic for, that's again a kind of denial of service. So how would you go about finding that out? Well, you could run a trace route on it. The problem is the internet is asymmetric with its routing. So once you go one hop, oh, that works. Two hops, that works. Oh, third hop, oh, that doesn't work anymore. You actually don't have an idea, you don't have a very good idea as to where the source of the problem is. That is it on the reverse path? Was it that hop? Is it on the reverse path from it? If you can spoof packets, legitimately. Again, you don't want to spoof packets that are larger than what you could send normally. Like they need to be something that where the response is the same size. Then you could send the packet along some path and then towards a different path that you know is actually working, and that way actually build a reliable structure to be able to identify individual failed nodes in the network, or ones that are not properly routing the packets that they are.
So Damon, I want to ask you, I know one of the sort of interesting subsets of the DDoS ecosystem are these booters. And I know from having the pleasure of reading some of your... Oh, there's a quick... Do we have a question? I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Algus Regis Google. So since, realistically speaking, if you have 1 million entities that need to fix themselves, it's not going to happen. You're doomed to failure. Like 15 years ago, there were a couple of papers about building in defenses into the infrastructure, things like DDoS pushback and stuff like that. Is there any hope in that? Is there a reason that that never really went anywhere, that the core routers just let all the traffic through, wherever, whatever?
So this is a really interesting question. You could also, I think, there are active, I think Cloudflare and several other companies are in the space of providing DDoS services, DDoS protection, and I think you'd be in a better position to answer those questions. But with respect to internet changes, there have been essentially no internet changes. I mean, to a first approximation, if the thing that you need to do is to change the protocols by which you would interchange between ISPs, that requires global agreement. It just takes a very long time. IPv6 was standardized in 1992. Just to give you a sense of how long these things take.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I can say a bit about this, but I think it would be best served to save this for sort of later conversations. But from the perspective of modern DDoS providers, the most important thing is dropping packets. And these sort of more intelligent feedback mechanisms really just haven't been adopted. Dropping packets fast, and dropping packets in the right place in the network has been the most effective mechanism that actually literally works right now.
Great, thanks.
So let me, well, maybe you're going to answer this later, but I thought actually another part of that question is what the motivations are of the customers who are needing to deal with DOS. I mean, like, where is the money being spent on DOS defense, and where is it coming from? To kind of give you a sense as to why some solutions are getting applied and some other ones aren't. So nobody makes any money off of applying a spoofing filter. You think it's a good thing for people to do, and you can shame them or whatever. But in terms of like an actual like business model for deploying these solutions, there isn't one there. So I thought it would be actually interesting to try to understand. I have my speculation of it, but good to have you actually comment on it.
Oh, in terms of
what the motivations are for people who are buying the service.
Well, typically people who are buying DDoS services are getting DDoSed, or they're being threatened by DDoS, whether through ransom or through I guess what sort of content they are, and maybe potentially if they are in a country, they have political speech, they have artistic speech, sort of at-risk websites are often targeted for DDoS. So oftentimes you do need to protect those who don't have money to be able to afford sort of very expensive DDoS services. So Cloudflare offers something called Project Galileo. Google has something called Google Shield as well to help these websites. But the majority of DDoS customers are not only paying for DDoS services to keep their website up, but they're also saving money on bandwidth. As long as I guess the way Cloudflare works is it sits in front of your website at sort of closer to the edge of the network. And if you can filter traffic closer to the edge of the network, not only does it save bandwidth on the core of the network, but it can prevent you from having to pay bandwidth bills internally. So DDoS protection can often be a cost saver as well as something to keep your site available or your service available.
So it also seemed like, and again, it's more of a question to the panel than something that I necessarily know all that much about anymore. Some speculation, I think this is essentially Arbor's business model for DDoS, which is to sell to ISPs, and that essentially their question, like if you were to ask the ISPs, is DDoS a problem for them, they would say yes. And the reason that it would be a problem is partly that they have customers who complain to them, oh, I'm getting DDoS, what can I do about it? And they would say, oh, go sign up for Cloudflare, and then that'll help solve that problem. But also that if you're an ISP and one of your customers starts to get DDoSed, you've just caused the problem for all the rest of your company, all the rest of your users. And so one of the challenges of these systems is also to essentially, or motivations for solutions, is within an ISP to be able to isolate traffic from the people who are being DDoSed against the people who are essentially collateral damage for that. Yeah.
So I think I'm long past the end of my NDA, so I can, although I like all the Arbor folks, I don't feel like I don't have to share secrets. But I think what was interesting at the early days of Arbor was talking about these value propositions. For the ISPs, we would go into rooms and try to sell to the ISPs, and there would be ISPs that would tell us that we don't want to have a DDoS solution because we charge our customers by the byte that goes over their network, and we're net neutral. We're not responsible for what content you get. We just transit the content for you. Now, I think as internet traffic became, and don't get me wrong, I don't want to paint this broad picture of this evil ISP, but there were people that wanted to do the right thing as well. But I think what then drove it for the ISPs was you were looking at differentiating the quality of service. So as the margins got smaller and smaller and smaller on providing bandwidth traffic, you were looking for ways to differentiate the service that you were providing from others. And I remember this in circa 2000 something, Clean Pipes initiative from AT&T, right? They were going to charge you 15% more for your bandwidth, but we were going to have things built into the network like DDoS protection. And you were going to get a better quality of service by paying that extra 15% premium. So there was ways of sort of thinking about then why that's a responsibility. Now, certainly as a community, technically, one of the reasons why this happens is there's a huge number of volumetric attacks. And so it's infeasible or impractical in some cases to filter at the customer edge, right? So you've got a T1, I can fill up a T1, I guess now I'm dating myself, but even a 10 meg pipe is easy to fill up
the
with
machine on my desk.
Right, yeah, exactly. You actually all got filtered because of the bandwidth problems we were having yesterday. You still had more traffic than that. So again, I'm dating myself there. But you had to do it, right? Because there's actually, in some cases, no other solution. You couldn't have some device that sat in front of you and scrubbed it. By the time it got to you, that pipe was full. There was nothing you were going to do about it. So there are certain classes of attacks that have to require some of that cooperation. So maybe we can flip it around a little bit. So I know I was going to ask you, Damon, a little bit earlier about booters and this booter ecosystem. One of the things I think, besides the fact that they rely a lot on these amplification attacks, is an interesting class of not just attack vectors, but attack reasons. So why, so maybe tell us a little bit about what booters are for those of us in the room that don't know, and talk a little bit about what some of the motivations are for the attackers to launch those attacks and how that value proposition works for them.
So these basically DDoS for profit kind of services are very interesting. They're driving a lot of the DDoS threats that we see currently today. So for those of you that don't know, the term booter comes from basically these video gamers that were playing online video games like Halo, Call of Duty, and they might not be so good at killing people, but they still wanted to win, and they didn't care if they cheated to win. And so they figured out that, right, it's someone's residential link. It's very easy to DOS someone's residential link. These services like Xbox just leak your IP address, or services like Skype and things like that. And so they began to, the origins of these is they began to rent these virtual private servers for very cheap, for like $5, $10 from these cut rate ISPs. And then they would scan for a whole bunch of these open DNS resolvers. They would get a list of these open DNS resolvers, and then they would just direct these volumetric attacks at their competitor, booting them offline and thus allowing them to win that round of Halo or whatever, and improve their Xbox Live rating or something like that, so they could look very elite. And so this was kind of the origins of this. And originally these were kind of run privately, personally by the video gamers themselves. And then they realized that, hey, I'm not using it all the time. I can let my buddies use it, and we can split the cost of it. So we each kick in a few dollars a month, and we get to share this service. And then from there, they began to just kind of commercialize this and realize, hey, wait a second, there's some money involved in this. And so they could basically do kind of the oversubscription model, the gym membership model, where they have a very small number of these servers. They can, at any one time, they can only launch a very small number of attacks. But if you get a whole bunch of subscribers, you can start making lots and lots of money off of these kinds of services. And so this is kind of how these booters have come about. And so originally it was this. Then people started running these Minecraft servers. And there's actually money involved in these Minecraft servers. The players of these Minecraft servers pay subscriptions to these Minecraft server operators. They buy like specialty items in these Minecraft servers. And so these people realized that they could start potentially extorting these Minecraft server people and say, hey, if you don't, pay up, we're going to DDoS your Minecraft server. And so then, and they launched the attacks. They didn't build up their own infrastructure. They simply paid one of these other booters to launch the attacks for them. And so this really ratcheted up even more in terms of the attacks. Now there was real money involved in this, where you could shake down these Minecraft server people for real dollars. And so at this point, they could shake them down. But the problem with this and the extortion model is, if you pay up and someone else, will realize that you pay up when the DDoS attacks occur. And so these Minecraft servers quickly wised up and said, we can't pay these extortions because then we can just get DDoSed more. And so they started looking for anti-DDoS services at this point. And the DDoSers themselves realized this. And so they hit upon another, it's almost a classic protection model kind of business model, where it comes from the mob, where you're on the corner store, break someone's window, and you say, oh, when you want some protection from that. And so they began running anti-DDoS services in parallel with the DDoS services. So they would DDoS someone, and then their anti-DDoS front would come and offer these anti-DDoS services and say that we're going to protect you. And a lot of times they didn't even drop packets and stuff like that. It was simply that they would just stop attacking them. And if any other of these attack services attack them, they would attack that attack service and take them offline so they could no longer attack people that were under their protection from these services. And so this started driving even more revenue to these things. And so we've lucked out and gotten some kind of economic records from these booter services that have leaked over the years. And sometimes they can be making upwards of $30,000, $40,000 a month off of these booter services these days. So this is the scale that you're dealing with. And we measured in their launching them. I had to come up with a new metric to measure DDoS attacks because of these things. So we now have the DDoS year. And so some of these services were launching probably about 10 to 20 DDoS years per month off of their services. So each of these is basically an entire year's worth of DDoS being launched off these. So in just 1 month, they were launching that many attacks. So hundreds of thousands of millions of attacks, years worth of DDoS every year coming at these things. And so this is one of the reasons why DDoS has become basically ubiquitous. And so many sites need the protection of people like Cloudflare and Proxy and these guys.
So it would seem like, that's a great set of anecdotes. But it would seem like that would be relatively easy to fix. Like either at the hosting company, which of course wouldn't have an incentive necessarily to turn them off, but on the other hand, possibly does have an incentive to turn them off if, say, the rest of the planet decided to blacklist any hosting company that is hosting a booter. There have been examples, for example, where addressing credit card use for spammers had an effect, or other things where attacking the revenue flow or some part of the ecosystem. So I don't know if you could comment on whether you think any of those techniques would be effective.
So I actually have done follow-up studies on several of these things. So I dug into their infrastructure, both their technical infrastructure and their payment infrastructure, as well of these booter services. And so when I first started studying, virtually all of them, their payment method was PayPal, was what they accepted in payment. And so one of my first studies was I actually teamed up with PayPal. We wrote some crawlers that basically enumerated all of the major booters. They're not hard to find because they have to advertise for customers. And so they're very easy to find, and we basically just wrote crawlers that enumerated all of the PayPal accounts that they were using to accept money. And this is actually how we linked them to the anti-DDoS services, because oftentimes it would be the same PayPal account being used for the booter services for the anti-DDoS services. So that was a good way of linking them together for these things. And we then reported these accounts to PayPal. PayPal did a little bit of investigation, froze their money, and closed them down. And we continued this for, within a few months, a lot of these services were going under. And the other thing that they started doing is accepting Bitcoin. Unfortunately, Bitcoin adoption is raising. However, we noticed that when they moved to Bitcoin, their user base would normally kind of plummet and things like that. The revenue would definitely drop off. And we recently did a study looking at it. And so Bitcoin keeps them marginally profitable, but nowhere near as profitable as they were when they had PayPal plus Bitcoin as a payment method.
Right. So a lot of these booter services use bulletproof hosting and these kind of services that are hard to shut down in countries that don't necessarily have the same laws. But they've also moved towards actual botnets and compromised machines. And this is something. There's the paper is going to be presented tomorrow about the Mirai botnet as an example of how some people who are doing these DDoS for hire, they're not using legitimate services that are servers and VPSs and whatnot. They're using compromised machines and using these compromised machines to do things like amplification attacks. People like Cloudflare and Prolexic and other DDoS providers are actually getting pretty good at blocking volumetric attacks. It's not really technically that hard to do a volumetric attack. So they've actually started evolving to less volumetric and more kind of direct attacks. Some of the largest attacks we've seen lately have been direct, legitimate DNS queries. And how can we overload the application layer at DNS? Or how can we overload the application layer at HTTP? And this sort of volumetric attacks still happen, but they're less effective with the pervasiveness of services like Cloudflare that are low cost for blocking these things, and they're kind of moving up the OSI model of applications.
Yeah, you would expect. We'll get question. But let me follow up for just a second, and then it would seem like it would be the case that signature-based filtering would be effective for volume, these kind of amplification attacks. And so anyway, that was just, as opposed to botnet attacks. So, which is to say that if you're not doing amplification, that is, if you're not spoofing or doing something like that, then it looks just like a regular, access. It's much harder to do whatever filtering you would have, and so. It was this observation that I think a bunch of companies in the DOS space, say Arbor and others, had observed essentially the growth of botnets roughly at the same time as we started to see these DOS attacks. And it's not too surprising that we're back to botnets as the way that we would do this, because it actually does have this property that makes it much harder to filter. Anyway, so go ahead.
So far we have been talking about like volumetric attacks and reflection-based attack. But what's the percentage, especially Nick, you could answer this question, is what's the percentage of asymmetric attacks that are like slow rate, like slow LRS or TLS renegotiation? So what's the percentage of those attacks that you see, which doesn't necessarily flood the system, so it might be hard to like detect or drop, but actually focus on some weaknesses in the protocol?
Well, it's hard to put a percentage, but it's definitely growing. And I reread the paper, actually, and it mentioned 150,000 packets per second as this is a big attack. And you can drop 150 packets per second on a single Linux box right now. So we're seeing things like 150 million packets per second attacks daily, basically. And these are distributed worldwide. So there's there's an interesting technique where this volumetric attack is also used to hide these higher level application attacks. So I can't really say what percentage, but they are definitely becoming more complex, and we're seeing more of interesting asymmetric type attacks that are not sort of dumb fill your pipes or send enough packets that will overload your router.
So a good resource for that too is Arbor does this infrastructure security report every year, and it's not based off of their data. They survey several thousand ISPs, and they generally get several hundred responses back from the ISPs. So this is ISP self-reported data. What is the biggest attack you've seen? What is your biggest worry? Last year's number, I think, was 76% were volumetric at 72. Zane, do you remember what we quoted in the Mirai paper? 60. So roughly two-thirds were volumetric in the last year that was reported. Now, again, that was self-reported data for some fraction of the ISP, so go read the methodology, take it with a grain of salt. But still lots of volumetric stuff happening, but there is this interesting trend, and I think it challenges, I think maybe we'll get some questions from the queue, but if we come back to it, it really does challenge some of the ways that we're doing some of this work as we move up that stack a bit. Do you want to say what's something, or you grab a question?
I was just going to mention that, yeah, one of the things while investigating these types of Booter and other DDoS for hire services is that you can see the trends of these things, and they are starting to offer their customers basically anti-DDoS attacks, and these are powered by Mirai botnets and other things.
So hi, I've been sitting there just more and more scared, slowly, and then Nick brought up the topic which was scaring me, so I figured I'll come over here. So like in a modern, maybe I'm just naive, but the simple DOS attacks or DDoS attacks seem comparatively easy, or our community has figured out how to deal with. But the application level DOS attacks seem increasingly scary to me, and all of the things mentioned, right? Like reports. I don't know how we will get reports of, because ISPs cannot measure which of these TLS packets were actually going to cause an application level DOS. Netflix had a great talk. I don't know if everyone's seen this, at Black Hat, called the microservice DOS, where just one single HTTP request can fan out to, like thousands of requests internally and take down the site. And so I guess I'll ask the panel, like, what's our path forward? Or do you think, it's just all going to burn down and then we'll try to figure something out? Or are we, as a community, are we working on addressing it, like from measurements, detection, respond, recovery, all of these aspects of, from identifying, protecting, respond, recovery, all of that? What's our current plan as a community? Because I'm scared.
I have nothing to.
Oh, you have nothing.
No, continue to be scared. No, I
think mic drop. Yeah, that's okay. So I guess I will say something along this line. I mean, at some level, I think this notion of growth, just in part coming back to the paper and the kind of time of the paper, of the Test of Time Award paper, that. Prior to that, I mean, there were large-scale certainly large-scale botnets, large-scale DOS outages, but it wasn't like a common, continual background thing. But what you could see at roughly that point in time was kind of exponential growth in the size of botnets. That people started to chain botnets, started to have them as like background things. And I think one of the things that I think you can see over that history, and it gets at this Mirai question, is that we actually have gotten better at securing end hosts. Like at the time when the paper came out, like the botnets were desktop machines. They were people who hadn't upgraded, or they were just a set of like computers that people were using. By and large, people are not getting computers used for botnets, or as much as. The reason that Mirai is out there on webcams is because it's not as easy to go get, 1 million or 10 million or whatever end host machines. So we have actually made a bunch of progress. You could think of essentially as the botnet community kind of moving towards things that are, what's available, what's easy to get. And it seems to me like, okay, great, Mirai's shown us that the IoT devices are vulnerable, so we go try to fix them. And I think over a period of time, potentially, you could get to where there are just, we might well be at hard to be able to predict, but potentially cresting on the notion of how large these these kind of large-scale attacks are. Your question ended up being about like application-oriented ones. And the concrete example of this that I was just going to give was being around actually when the original internet search engines came up was roughly at about the time when the ping of death happened. And Mike Burrows gives this story about the ping of death and Alta Vista, which was one of the first large-scale web search engines. Anyway, his system was triply replicated. And the person who was launching the ping of death would essentially go around and actually try different servers to see whether they were vulnerable for them. And so at one point, like in the morning when ping of death happened, this packet came in and crashed one of the servers, and it's like, oh my gosh, what happened? But I've got 2 left, that's fine. Another ping of death came. Bang, the other server just crashed. Okay, it turned out that the person who was attacking said, oh, I guess 2 packets wasn't enough. They must be resilient to it. They must have patched it already. So the third one was still serving it. So possibly the solution to this is just, enough redundancy.
I would also put on my kind of economic lens to look at these more kind of specialty-focused DDoS attacks. And some of these are kind of expensive to actually find. And when you look at the low-end DDoS for hire servers, they're not really investing a whole lot in finding kind of novel new DDoS attacks. And so these might be a threat, like if they want to get like Sony Studios or something like that, and they'll unleash their 0-day DDoS attack. But after they've unleashed it, the word's kind of out, and people will start patching things. So these might allow you to focus fire on a particular service like Netflix or something like that. But I don't think that they kind of have the lifespan of these other kinds of attacks.
Yeah, I agree. I think to mount an effective layer 7 application layer attack, you have to know a little bit about the back end of the service or the site that you're attacking, and there are asymmetries in how any system is designed. I mean, a login is going to cost more than a cached image, no matter what. But yeah, I think the economic argument is a good one. People are not going to, unless they want their attack to be targeted, then it's less effective on everyone. So it's less of a global risk, but more of a specific risk if you work for a large target. And to follow up on your point, something that people attackers are moving towards, since end hosts are more secure and IoT is hopefully going to be patched up pretty soon. Maybe not, probably not.
Not quickly. But eventually.
But a great example of a sort of new and very dangerous DDoS threat is the Great Cannon attack, where you manage to get a hold of some content and inject JavaScript into it, and then suddenly you have an attack that can come from everything. That is very much a layer 7 attack, so you actually have valid HTTP requests, valid TCP, valid TLS, and coming from actual hosts sending real attacks. And I think that's going to be, it's more difficult to mount, but I think it's something that's going to be more and more prevalent.
Yeah, just to, other things you can be scared of. I think that might be a good topic here. So just one of those example things that you trip over when you start to do measurement studies. We actually accidentally created a ping of death for internet routers. And we were just doing internet measurement. We were, they were specialized in we tended to torture routers to be able to get them to tell us things that were, a little bit non-standard, but they were still, valid internet packets, valid, protocol packets, like measuring IP IDs or whatever. Anyway, we got this call from Cisco at one point that said, could we please stop this measurement study we were doing because it was just causing randomly some number of routers to just go crash. And it turned out actually it tripped over, not intentionally, but tripped over just by accident, a firmware bug. And it was like, oh, okay, there are firmware bugs that I can just send a packet to and cause those routers to just break. that's a problem, and particularly if they're not doing any kind of robust testing that would say, I should be able to send anything to this router and not have the problem for it. That the infrastructure question, that is what routers, what you could do to cause widespread outages at the infrastructure layer is quite disturbing. So a bunch of the early worms would just kind of accidentally go take down large sections of the internet, not because of volume, but because, say, as an example, the ARP tables were not built in a way that if you happen to send a large enough random set of addresses through them, that they would just crash because of buffer overflow problems. So there are these cases where you may or may not have problems. Another example, just within the internet space, was there was a large-scale outage, so like maybe 10 plus years ago now, where somebody just typed some configuration command into a router, just their local router. It happened to be my mistake. They didn't try to do it. That actually triggered an inconsistency bug between Cisco and Juniper routers that caused resets between any pair of routers where you had a Cisco and a Juniper router connected to each other throughout the entire internet. I was like, oh, okay, that's the internet offline for a couple days. And I was like, not somebody searching for it, right? So the notion that like our governments aren't actually out there with knowledge of these that could potentially be used at some point in the future is, I think, it seems likely that there would also be these other things that we would potentially be worried about. So more stuff for you to be worried about.
So I do want to get to audience questions, but
Yes.
I want to push back on one thing that you said at the very beginning, which is this idea that botnets we're getting better. And I do agree with you that I think that there are places where we see improvement in the quality of software and how well it's managed. But Mirai pops out as this great counterexample. A 200,000 bot, low-powered devices with no bandwidth. The vulnerability, I put it in air quotes, was default passwords being used. And that's big enough to launch a 700 gigabit per second attack that takes down DNS providers. So this is, I think that I think we should be worried about the complex attacks, but we should also be worried about why we still can't, at least universally, get us to do the easy stuff as well. This notion of security as a public good, and there's always going to be some free riders, and how do we address these people, either new to the table because it's IoT, and okay, maybe we can blame the compies for not taking CS classes and learning all the things we learned, but it seems to still happen, and it was configured before that, and they're just, for every time we say this, there seems to be a counterexample. So I'm not actually going to let you respond because I'm going to let the audience go, but that's a moderator privilege, so I just say that and just move on.
Nathan Downham from UPenn. So really new to kind of networking over the past several months and playing with Metronome, P4, some of these data layer things, and wondering, you mentioned like rate limiting and even doing kind of application layer filtering, and we're looking at, can we actually do deep packet inspection on these devices? And wondering how these would play into defenses, if they can be used, or if it's really like the algorithms are the problem, not necessarily the throughput of the processing and so forth.
Did you want to take P4, or do you want me to take P4? Oh, okay. So for those who don't know, there's been recently a kind of evolution of that's like the operational side of networking, or the research side of networking. You think of the opportunity to try to fold computation into routers. The first start of that was essentially to separate the data plane and the control plane in routers. So originally the internet was basically designed with each of the routers would be their own entity that you then like built protocols that would have everybody talk to each other and kind of come to some conclusion, some joint conclusion as to what to do. And then basically we separated it out, and this is now pretty common within ISP, large-scale ISP operations anyway, that you'd have a control plane that would basically tell the routers as to what they should be doing. That potentially makes them more easy to control and so forth. And then once you've done that, then you could think, oh, well, what services could I have? What additional knobs could I have inside of routers to make them, inside the data plane, to be able to make them more plastic for this control plane? Which over a couple of iterations has led to increasing amounts of computational ability that applied on data plane packets. Really exciting work. Still a little bit like out there in terms of how long it's going to be until you get them out. But there's this potential to be able to do line rate, 100 gigabit line rate, terabit line rate, computation, simple computation on a per packet basis. Not quite enough to be able to say, oh, I'm going to recognize this application level virus, right? That's not really what this is for, but would potentially allow you to say mark packets or do rate limiting of certain types of packets. You're not going to have large enough tables. It's still engineering, right? You won't have necessarily large enough tables to be able to do filtering on a large number of addresses, but potentially could do more effective the kind of internal access to it. I guess since it was a question, I wanted to get to what I think the answer would be. So that was all set up. Most of this is going to get deployed, at least initially, inside of individual ISPs, which is the ISPs are deploying them internally for managing their own networks better. And so you may well end up seeing these kinds of essentially active computation. You think of them as computation, but they're actually happening in hardware. So active programmable computation that's happening on a per packet basis inside of ISPs that could provide any number of different types of services. Of which DDoS, filtering or rerouting would be one of them. You could say, oh, this customer over here is getting DDoSed. Let's reroute their traffic over here to some Arbor node that's going to then do some more filtering. That kind of thing is actually quite feasible with technology that's just coming online today. And so those types of things are likely. What you won't generally see is that happening across ISPs. That's actually just a much harder set of questions, or much harder to do. So anything that you could solve within an ISP, possible, but otherwise not.
Hi, Mihai Cristodorescu, Visa Research. So I want to go back to all these millions of boxes and networks out there. They're too open and they allow spoofing and amplification, all this stuff. And you mentioned that basically the best tool we have right now to fix that is through shaming. And I think somebody else mentioned that shaming doesn't scale, basically. So I'm wondering, has anybody tried or looked at actually money, right? At what price point can we get these people to actually configure their boxes? Is there a price point?
You mean incentivize people to try and fix their machines? Yeah, that would be an interesting study. I don't think anyone has tried to.
So I think that part of the difficulty that we have with this problem, and you could probably comment a bit about this on the economic side, which is who gets attacked. I mean, it's mostly people who are small scale. I mean, the thing that actually got me somewhat re-interested in this area was that at some level, there's I'm going to extort some people. Well, they have to be small enough that I can actually have an effective attack against them. They're not extorting money from Facebook or Google because they're just too large to be able to have Mirai have anything at all to do with them. So they tend to be small scale things, which ends up being okay, yes, I wouldn't like to be DOS attacked if I get DOS attacked. Well, except that I don't have any money to go pay, I don't have the $1 billion to go pay people to go upgrade their systems. But Google does, but Google doesn't get attacked. So I do think that there's this aspect of it being small fry that because of whatever reasons. I think the other thing that's troubling about it is that it can be used for censorship. That is, if somebody decides, say, Anonymous decides that they don't like you today, you said something controversial, that therefore they're going to launch a DOS attack at you, and suddenly, bang, right? You can't do anything for weeks at a time. There was even, this has been an issue for a long time. There was this VP of Qualcomm, I think, who just for some reason somebody didn't like him, so he had this, several year process of having his home IP address get DOSed.
So Mihai, I'll say one place that I'm aware that some of these kind of incentive structures start to come into place, and we'll see where this goes because it's still, of course, the very early days of cyber insurance. So you can imagine, people are trying to figure out what does it mean to have a well-maintained set of cyber infrastructure, and things like, hey, externally I can monitor how well configured your devices are, thousands of open DNS servers in your network probably means you're not paying attention to what's going on in your network, and that might be useful in understanding whether or not you'll have a data breach later or with some other security event. So you start to see at least some economic incentives there, because of course premiums will eventually be set by hopefully not nebulous contentless standards, but by a section that really correlates with negative security behavior. I know, Damon, you want to say something too?
But yeah, I think that there are limits to just technically trying to get rid of all the amplification attack and all of the kind of botnets. Because the other thing I'd like to point out is that I'm not sure if botnets have been shrunk that much. We still have millions and millions of desktop botnets. The problem is that they can make money doing other things. So they can make more money doing click fraud than they can DDoS with these desktop botnets. It's just the fact that with these IoT devices, they haven't found anything more profitable than just lobbing packets at people. And so this I think is the real reason why these IoT botnets are getting just used to lob packets at people, because they can't figure out how to ransom people's files or do click fraud that makes far more money than DDoS.
Yeah, my understanding is that people do use compromised end hosts for DDoS, but maybe you'd be able to comment, which is to say that there's kind of this percolation effect after you've strip mined a botnet, some compromised end host machine for click fraud and then for spam, then eventually it gets blacklisted everywhere, and then you use it for DDoS. So in some ways, the fact that if you get better at automatic spam filtering, potentially you're actually going to see an increase in DDoS attacks, because it's one of those things you can do kind of brute force without too much difficulty. So I think that, I'm not going to say necessarily that we're we're going to have this solved, but at some level you can actually see some of this being progress. We actually got better at spam, so we've got more DDoS, right? So.
And I don't know who was up at the mic first. So.
Cool. Hey, Deepak, University of Illinois. I'm just wondering from the panel, are we now in the long tail of DDoS, in your opinion, in that have we seen the worst and we are kind of fixing the smaller problems, or are there still way worse problems yet to come? And if so, what do you think those are?
I don't think we're in the long tail. I think worse things are going to come. I think Mirai is a good, simple example of an IoT device that was built insecurely and was not leveraged to its full attacking potential, I guess. I mentioned also the JavaScript attack. There's many, many different venues to do DDoS, and the attackers are really going for the lowest hanging fruit, and I think there'll be more creative solutions down the line. And to count out the sort of fraud industry or the people trying to make money on the internet is really a bad choice.
Yeah, I think as long as there's this unfortunately virtuous cycle or vicious cycle of them getting more capital and them being able to invest that capital and kind of honing their attacks. We've seen this over and over again, like with the botnets, where, if they have this inflow of capital and these resources, they're just going to keep getting more inventive and inventive with it as they can extract more and more money from it. So we're going to see a bad cycle if that continues.
Yeah, I guess I'm taking a slightly more optimistic point of view. There was this notion that somebody, I think back in 1970, predicted the point at which we would get to peak oil production, roughly about now. And, they were about right. There will be a peak sometime in the future. I think it probably still is in the future. I'm not necessarily going to expect when it is, but I think that you can start to see maybe the inflection of downward. That is that we have actually, that if we hadn't done, the other way of looking at it is if we hadn't done anything, we would be really, really bad shape right now. Like, we have actually applied a bunch of things to try to prevent widespread DOS attacks that would be just gigantic today if we hadn't been, say, for example, Microsoft had not done a gigantic corporate effort, multi-billion-dollar effort, to try to nail down where problems were happening inside of, so it's like systematic understanding of where every bug happened within a Microsoft Windows system, and to go fix it, and then to try to figure out how to train engineers so that they're not producing those bugs in the first place, that those systems are now much more secure than they were 20 years ago when this paper got written. So So we have actually made some progress against this. It's not, oh, the worst is to come. Maybe the worst is to come, but like, it's not going to keep going forever. I think it's not going to keep getting worse forever.
Yeah, so I think a lot of DDoSes don't have an effect right now, but they are massive and much bigger than they were in the past. So maybe a more interesting question is, what does the internet architecture have to look like so that people are able to, continue this free and open access to information and data that we all enjoy right now? And is that going to continue when volumes get to the point where it's simply too expensive for certain things?
Sorry, we have a question.
So we talked about filtering at like different levels based on like IPv4 addresses, and then we talked about IoT. What does Panel think about the adoption of IPv6, where everything and every atom would have probably an IP address? And how does that scale with like filtering when you have so many addresses, and if you try even filtering each independent IP by itself, there wouldn't be enough resources in any single machine to filter that amount of traffic. So what do you guys think about how does the threat landscape change with respect to DDoS, especially with the adoption of IPv6?
I wouldn't want to hold back IPv6 because of, or things like, okay, let's stop. Our filtering rules are not complex enough. I think the industry has to adapt, and IPv6 is going to be coming. It's just an evolution of tools. Vern.
Isn't there a basic thing that with V6 you filter on prefix, not on full address?
Yeah, and that's sort of another thing. The bottom 64 bits of your IPv6, if you cut that off, you're basically back into IPv4 to the power of 2.
Yeah, I assume that also that if you, maybe but that if you start filtering on IPv4 addresses, then the problem ends up being, well, they're just reused. So, everything is natted. So, like, somebody has a botnet node on the back end of an ISP. Do you take out the entire neighborhood? Not really. So, it's not necessarily like so easy to solve the problems with IPv4 either. It may actually be easier to do it with IPv6.
So I'm Yongdae Kim from KAIST. When I saw the spam house attacks impact on the links, I was always wondering about, for example, some of DDoS actually targets like internet exchange itself, so that actually they can disconnect some countries. And there are many small countries have actually very limited bandwidth, and if they target the gateways like that, may affect actually disconnect different countries. I think in case of Korea, they have only 1 terabyte of bandwidth, and probably I think disconnecting that is maybe possible. And also there are other examples, for example, cellular gateways, for example, and if you can disconnect the data service by targeting some of those DDoS. What do you think about those directions?
Sure. I think this goes back to motivation. The spam house attack, as you referenced, started by attacking a website and then moved upstream to the London Internet Exchange, and that caused degradation of internet in the entire country of England. And this was kind of a politically motivated attack. A lot of the DDoSes that we see now are based on video games and extortion and the different types of financial gains you can get by targeting sites. Targeting the infrastructure itself is not actually where we see most of the traffic, but it's a good point. You have to be able to withstand these sort of things. It's just not the most common types of attacks and attackers and targets that we most often see.
Yeah, I think that these kinds of attacks are perpetrated by a very specific kind of issue, as you said, right, some vendetta against a specific organization or something like that. And so I think these are kind of just one-time flare-ups. But right, the profit-motivated people don't want to kill the golden goose. So they want to keep the internet functional, and they just want to make it as targeted as they can to extract money from people. So most DDoS attacks are more focused at extracting some goal rather than these kind of temper tantrums that someone might make.
Yeah, but nevertheless, countries do sometimes do things that would get them to be unpopular, and So in the sense of censorship or politically motivated attacks, I think that is an issue. I would point out, since it hasn't come up before, the internet actually looks quite different. Your mental model of the internet is likely, if you went to school 10 years ago or so ago, somewhat different from how the internet actually works today. There's been a flattening in some ways of the internet with cloud deployments. And the consequence of that is essentially to put either cloud equipment or end user facing computers, servers, in a large number of different ISPs in a large number of different cities around the world. Google operates this, or Azure, or AWS. And essentially, as we move increasing numbers of services into the cloud, those services, particularly the large-scale ones, get spread geographically over a large region, that you could do a targeted volume attack at a particular country, but that's difficult to mount in some ways because just you have the actual service may well actually have a representative that's running inside of Korea already, so you still have access to Facebook or whatever.Maybe consistency goes out the window because Facebook can't get outside, but usually these services actually have their own private stuff that doesn't traverse the internet between their data centers. So there's a lot of resilience that's happening in the internet just to solve essentially distributed systems problems. So the reliability issues cause people to build systems that'll be more resilient to like targeted attacks. Pretty difficult to take something that runs in 1,000 data centers offline, just because the amount of bandwidth that would be required to be able to have any meaningful impact on that is small. And also the DNS infrastructure is put in place to be able, if there was a targeted thing, these customers can't get to this data center, then sure, there's just reroute to a different place. So it can be quite difficult actually. We build in systems that because of failure recovery that potentially give us more resilience. At least for these widespread.
And I think you said this too, I want to mention this as well. While there's this resilience for these broader services, the things that Google or Facebook might provide, there is this real issue about the impact of DDoS as a censorship mechanism, because there's not everybody is as well provisioned or as replicated or as reliable as those services.
Right.
So an individual doesn't have access to that same kind of replicated infrastructure unless somebody steps up, and you see these projects where they're using that replicated infrastructure to provide, but there is this an individual stands no chance. Right? There's too asymmetric. So, and if you have one comment, then I want to get to the...
Just to add on to that, I think IP anycasting is something that's coming more and more to use more and more.
Sorry.
No, I mean Cloudflare is a fully IP anycasted TCP and DNS system. So if you were to launch an attack against a single IP, it wouldn't. One of the reasons that the DDoS protection works is that generally you can't direct all your traffic to a single machine or a single choke point. It's definitely not the way that the entire internet can work, but in terms of actually protecting the IP infrastructure, that's another point that sort of follows on to what was just said.
Hi, Sujin from Carnegie Mellon. So it seems like the DDoS attacks these days get smarter. For instance, they do sort of like probing sort of things for the defenders to showcase their defense postures and so on. Is there a particular, if that's the case, is there a particular reason why such the trend is going that way? Is that because the defense, like attackers now have more motivation to use less resources, or is it because the defenses are getting so much better now that attackers are concerned about it? So I'm just curious, what would be the real reason behind attackers getting smarter and so on?
I think that they have to in order for their attacks to be effective. Like Nick said, right, they're seeing a lot of attacks that just simply aren't effective anymore. And so in order to actually DDoS someone, they're having to probe and get creative.
I think you do actually see quite a lot of like trial and error among the attack set. At least that's always been true. It's been true for a while, which is people trying to do DDoS or trying to take people off, like the ping of death example that I had, that people would try to do something, and then if it's not successful, they stop. And the reason that I think you don't get that many DDoS attacks against Google is, well, they're big, so it won't work. So there is this aspect of, well, they're needing to do things in a different way or whatever to be able to get the things that they want to happen.
Yeah, I would say you see the evolution both in the micro and the macro, right? So it's a great example of what happened with the spam house. You do something that's simple and straightforward until it stops working, and then you try something else. And for an individual attack, you will watch that evolution, and I think you can see that play out at a larger scale as well. As we get better at doing things, they get more inventive because they still need to make money, and so they're going to figure out a way to do that.
So your comment on peak oil struck something in me. That prophecies of peak thingy are almost always wrong. Peak food was wrong because nitrogen fertilizer. Peak oil is wrong because fracking. There was a paper in the 80s or 90s where someone said, no, 64K DRAM, that's the maximum you could ever do. And a 256 shipped when the paper was published. The next year, that guy wrote another one, said 256 this time for sure. Guess what? I used to care about disk space and manage it, and I don't care anymore because disks are getting bigger faster than we can fill them. What are the chances that the internet can grow its way out of DDoS and the DDoSers just become ankle biters?
Well, it's interesting to look at different pieces of hardware and how they scale with size. Routers, if you go 10x in throughput, it's a very big jump in costs. So it's really hard to say. You think of CPUs haven't really increased in frequency in a long time. I mean, Moore's law continues, but sometimes in different directions. So it's hard to say. So
I guess the data center networking trends are bandwidth continues to increase at an extremely fast rate. So commodity switches within generally the data center network is commodity switches and just enormously fast. It's fiber down to the rack and then electrical within the rack. That's 40 gig is not too hard. 100 gig is soon. Even though the CPUs themselves are not speeding up as quickly as they had been, network bandwidths inside the data center are still scaling at enormous rates. What you don't see, and this is partly the flattening of the internet aspect, what you don't see necessarily is that happening kind of, yes, the bandwidths for long haul are going up, but that's a really expensive thing to do for long haul. So most of the long haul work, I think, increasingly in the future is going to be internal cloud to cloud, as opposed to internet-based communication. You can think of any data center as being the solution. Data centers being the solution to the Moore's law problem. That is, if your CPUs aren't going to get faster, we're just going to build gigantic mainframes that are the size of football fields and cost $1 billion each, and are now scalable. That we understand how to build networks for that. And it would be because they're servers, because they're data centers, because they're really well managed. You're not having DOS, not generally. I don't know. Maybe somebody will come up with a way of doing DOS inside the data center, but hasn't to date been a huge problem. Maybe. Yeah.
Well, and I would say too that this is it, and this echoes, I believe, what you were saying. It's this issue of vertical versus horizontal scaling. I don't think we're going to outgrow the attacks by building 100 gig or 200 gig lines, because that becomes more and more expensive. It's going to be the horizontal scaling. We're going to see more replication, a flatter network topology, fewer hops. And so it's going to be more expensive. We're going to outgrow them, but we're going to outgrow by replicating. We're going to go horizontal rather than just necessarily trying to go faster. Build the next big DPI device that's going to go at a 10 gig rate. That's just going to lag. So we're just going to become more resilient because we're going to get flatter, because we have more copies of things, that kind of stuff.
So along the line of Crispin's comment, and also I think your comment, if we put those together, your comment regarding, Google's so big that no one bothers to attack it, at some point, can we get the state of DDoS defenses, maybe by leveraging cloud services, by leveraging this horizontal effect? I guess at what point do we reach the level where a DDoS attack, so an attacker puts a lot of effort into a DDoS attack and gets nothing out of it, so they just all give up? Is that Can that happen? Or because of a combination of growth of bandwidth and defenses? Or do you think the attackers will just keep pouring more into it until eventually something gives?
I think that implies I guess, de-diversification of the internet. You like some massive consolidation inside of some large cloud providers, which
we could take a bet on.
Could happen, could not.
No, it's going to happen.
So does it also mean that if every website today gets...
So does it mean that if every website today goes behind Cloudflare, Akamai, and Google Project Shield, we solve DDoS forever?
No, I don't think that's really what he was, or what this statement was. But
well,
like, if
that's
I'm,
what I was, that's part of what
part
I
was. Part of where he's going. But like, if I'm running a service, like I don't know, I'm the IRS or something like that, just like particularly like target for DDoS, but it has complicated architecture. Like it's not like just static content that I can do. You actually have to run computation. You have to think that it's actually a service that's being offered, has logins or whatever else. I mean, there are lots of circumstances where you would have essentially movement of the kind of customer-facing things into the cloud, and as opposed to somebody running their own thing that's going to be small scale or only in one place. That anybody who moves into the cloud was going to get. They're probably going to do it not because of DOS or whatever. They're going to do it because it's cheaper, or they can outsource a bunch of things, or it gives them faster evolution, easier to get the advantages of Amazon's service stack or Google service stack or whatever. Those are reasons for why people are doing that, and I think only that trend is massively fast today, and you're going to see that happening where a lot of the kind of company level stuff is going to move into the cloud, and that is kind of almost by automatic will be more DOS resilient than something that's in any individual place. It doesn't necessarily solve the I'm a dissident hosting a website that the Syrian government wishes to take offline, or I just did something that made Anonymous mad at me. That part, yeah, that's probably not soon. Maybe that comes someday.
But doesn't Cloudflare or Project Shield or something like that solve that problem?
I think for volumetric, perhaps, yeah.
Let me push back a little bit on this and introduce the concept of economic DDoS, which is something that springs up when you start going to metered cloud services and things like this, right, where maybe the goal isn't any longer to drive you offline, it's to drain your EC2 account of money to the point where, right, you either have to pony up more money to EC2 or you go down or something like this. And then this also spills into things like Bitcoin and other things where you can DOS these kinds of platforms as well too economically by expending more money to DOS them with too much transaction volume.
So
yeah,
I think these are two different things. So one, we're talking about denial of service because of technical, like memory and resource, and then we're talking about a wholly different resource, which is money.
I think that the two are equivalent.
Yeah.
Okay, so we should look that in like tandem to each other rather than treating them two different things.
Yeah, I think if you were to come back 10 years from now and ask this same set of questions, what he said is, I think, fair. That will be where the action is, as opposed to ones that are just straight, I decide that Campbell Soup didn't resign from Trump's board soon enough, so let's DOS them, right? That kind of thing I think is going to be a lot harder to mount in the future.
And with that, we're out of time. So if we could please thank the panelists before we leave.
And for that matter, the moderator.
Yeah.